We were talking with her off air. She's going to educate us about everything that's happening with the situation playing out in Iran. That is Kamin Mohammadi. She is an Iranian-British journalist and author. Kamin, Mike Leon, Nick Saveri, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast with us today.
Thank you guys so much for having me on. It's really a privilege. It genuinely is a privilege, that to be able to have this platform.
Well, I appreciate that. Again, another soundbite that will live in the annals of history of this show. Kamin, I want to get to the seriousness that's unfolding. We reached out to you because of the protests that are happening, not only globally in major cities that maybe haven't gotten the attention that they deserve in Toronto, in New York, and LA for the women of Iran, and what is happening there for our U.S. audience that maybe is steeped into what's happening on the U.S. news and politics space. Can you give a 30,000-foot overview of what happened in Iran with the death of Masa Amini and the subsequent protests that have happened in Iran?
Yes. On the 16th of September, a Kurdish Iranian girl called Masa Amini, she was in Tehran visiting family. As you may or may not know, Iran is very ethnically diverse within its own borders. That's why she was Kurdish Iranian, like me. Funnily enough, she comes from my paternal homeland. And she was taken by the morality police, which is something that we have in Iran, for bad hijab. Now, your listeners might know that in Iran, it's mandatory for women to be covered up, not our faces, but to have hair and body covered at all times. And mostly that has over the years been interpreted quite loosely sometimes, and they've been quite elaborate hairstyles. Now, every once in a while, they crack down on what they call bad hijab. And since April of last year, I believe, we've had a new president who's a hardliner called Ebrahim Rais. And he, at the beginning, I think, of this summer, he cracked down on the hijab laws. And that means that roaming the streets are troops of these morality police who are authorized to go up to, women and, slap them in the face if they feel like it, genuinely, and take them and say, you have bad hijab. Now, talking of bad hijab, Mahsa's hijab was relatively modest. She just had a few strands of hair poking out. She was nothing like some of the elaborate sort of fashionistas that you see in Tehran sometimes, So just to say that she wasn't particularly, she wasn't extreme either. They took her. There's some footage I've seen of them talking to her and her crying. I've heard some tapes of her saying, pleading with them, saying, I'm so sorry, I'm not from Tehran, I'm from a small town, I don't know what I've done wrong. They take her for what's called re-education. So they take her into custody, and her brother followed. So we know this in the 2 hours that she was in custody. They presumably beat her so badly that she ended up in a coma. So she ends up in hospital in a coma. And we have this extraordinary picture of her in ICU, all sort of tubed up. And they say that she died of a stroke and a heart attack. Her family say she had absolutely no problems medically. She was 22 and perfectly healthy. And that there was lots of signs of bruising around her head and neck, presumably. So they gave her, I have to say, allegedly, I suppose, a bad beating. She died. She died, and the protests went off, and they started in Saqqez in Kurdistan, which is where she's from. The protests went crazy in Kurdistan. They then were very brutally repressed in Kurdistan. Just in a matter of 2 days, I believe, something like 4 or 5 people reported killed by the security forces, 250 people arrested. However, people didn't stop. In fact, the protests spread. We're on day 19 now. The crackdown has been increasingly brutal, but the protests are still not stopping. So we've seen it not just in Tehran, the capital, but we've seen these protests going on in everywhere, all over Iran, in small towns, in provinces that are normally really quite far and quite sort of very poor and very ignored by Tehran. We had this a terrible massacre this weekend in Baluchistan, in Iranian Baluchistan, which is right on the border with Pakistan, where we have our ethnic Baluchis, who, where Shalwar Qamishli, and Zahedan, the capital of that province. Again, very, very poor. It was genuinely a massacre. I think they killed more people in that 1 or 2 days there than they had in the whole 2 weeks. However, I'll just give you some context. I wrote a piece on Friday where I said, as far as we know, there's 17 journalists in jail, and there's something like 70 to 180 people who've been killed. And I updated that piece yesterday, and it went 35 journalists that are in jail, reportedly a conservative estimate of 1,000 people who've been killed and 10,000 people who are now in jail. And that was before they attacked the other day Sharif University. So let me know if I'm, but if it's not clear. So these protests have been going on. We've had images which are utterly shocking. I mean, they're shocking. You think you're watching, a cop show, where these figures, that are dressed kind of like RoboCop. I mean, they're so armed up to the teeth. They are literally just on the streets, just shooting live bullets into the protests. The protesters, what we saw immediately afterwards, what started and what sometimes some people have maybe misconstrued as being a revolt against Islam, and it's not at all, but women started taking off their hijab, taking off their headscarves and walking around without them, holding them up, burning them, dancing around fires. Now, you have to know that under the Sharia law of Iran, it is forbidden for women to show their hair in public, to wear tight-fitting clothes, to sing or dance in public. So when we see images of women dancing around fires and throwing their headscarves in the fire, it really is unimaginable to us. And it does feel like the furies have been unleashed in Iran, because these women, these young women, they're overwhelmingly Gen Z, are just not taking any more. And what's been extraordinary about the protests is they've gone on and on. They're not just women, they're not just the young people. Men have been out there alongside women since 2009 at all the protests. Sometimes they put their hijab on themselves. And one of them, there are so many extremely amazing chants that are going around in these protests that we haven't heard before. And one of them is, "Don't be afraid, we are together. Don't be afraid, we are together." And there is this sense of unity that is extraordinary. Now, the regime has been shutting down and slowing down the internet for the duration. Yet there are VPNs being used. There's all sorts of sort of help coming, proxy servers, and there are still some videos coming out. So we're seeing really, really upsetting scenes of people being killed, shot, people being rounded up, but we're getting some information, and we're able to share this information with the world. And, many people say to me, I feel helpless, but people do watch the hashtags. And I've heard messages from inside Iran where people say, for all of these years, we felt very alone in our struggle. But to know that the world sees us and is behind us really makes us feel not alone. So I think it is really important. So these protests have gone on. They then start to call out national strikes. The universities go back in the meantime, and they start on the 1st of October, I think day 2. All the universities call a nationwide strike. They go on strike, and on October the 2nd, on Sunday, security forces arrive en masse at Sharif University. Now, Sharif University is our most elite university for, the best minds. So it's a kind of combination of Harvard, MIT, Oxford, all rolled into one. So imagine that troops show up at your most elite university, and they literally, I mean, the videos are horrific. They literally are running down these students like they're cattle. They're like rounding them up, and they trap them in an underground car park. They shot many lecturers and faculty members who inserted their bodies between the students and the security forces, thinking that would have an effect, and they got shot. The jails are full, I hear. They've taken many people. Now, that was extremely horrific in this scenario of extremely horrific things. But the following day, high schools went back, and you may have seen some of the videos of schoolgirls who have come out on strike, school kids come out on strike in support of Sharif and not just Sharif, but other universities also have come out. You know, I've seen footage from provincial universities in places like Esfahan, and people out there. And you know, when you see these mass bodies of young girls, all with their hair out, you know, chasing away sort of agents of the regime from inside their schools, it's extraordinary. I mean, it's extraordinary. So, yeah, that's
Oh,
a kind of nutshell.
it's a great summary. This is why podcasts are good a lot of the times. Let me ask you a follow up here before Nick jumps in, because I obviously I'm Cuban American. We were talking off air about Nick being Indian. So when I was talking to somebody, an immigration attorney who is Iranian, and I was asking them the similarities between how would I get family to leave Cuba versus how you would get family to leave Iran right now. She mentioned it's very, very difficult for our audience. Again, learning about this, like, how is it that people can leave Iran? Because you were exiled in before the revolution. Your father was. I read something recently about your father was under death threats, and your family fled Iran before the revolution happened. But now for people that are there, it is harder to leave. Can you kind of explain that process of how people can't just necessarily leave Iran, but just because of their neighboring countries and and everything around it? Can you explain that to our audience?
Absolutely. So there was a revolution in 1979. We were actually there for the revolution, and we left soon afterwards. Yes, my father and many people who weren't really involved in any way were just under threat, because I think this kind of thing happens in revolutions. Um, at that point, this Islamic regime came into power. Our revolution is often called an Islamic revolution, but it wasn't really. It started off very much as a socialist, as a Marxist, as a kind of uprising of workers and poorer people who wanted some kind of equality, who weren't happy about the rapid westernization and elitism under the Shah. They all united under the figurehead, they thought, of this quite harmless mullah called Khomeini, Ayatollah Khomeini, who then came back to Iran and took power and instituted what he called God's own government. So here we have God's own government, who now for the past 43 years has seen it fit to, I mean, even within the first few years of the revolution happening in the early 80s, this regime had killed more people than the Shah had in the whole of his 30-something years on the throne. And now I don't know who can keep count of all the atrocities that they have visited on our people. The reality is that Iran became a closed country now. The Iranian people have had it particularly hard because they've been vilified by the West, and they have also suffered at the hands of their own regime. So that's been one of the really painful things, is that because of the Islamic regime and Khomeini's government turning their back on the West, because they talked about West toxification and wanting to take Iran back to a really sovereign sort of culture. Iran has been a sort of pariah. In fact, the US has had sanctions on Iran since 1979. I mean, we hear about sanctions now, but they've been going on for a really long time. So Iran became a pariah, and that meant that, you know, our own Iranian passports became sort of worthless, in the sense that we couldn't travel. So traveling out of the country is very, very complicated. Very few places give you a visa. Very few people can afford to even go through the process of applying to leave. If, for example, when my father passed away in London some years ago, the remainder of his family, i.e. my cousins, because his brother and sister were already dead, who were the closest relatives that he had, we sent them, you have to send an invitation through the embassy to the people that you want to bring, even though they're your family and our people, because it happened very fast. There wasn't enough time to do this process, which takes a long time, and they were not considered first-degree relations, and so they were not considered to be a valid case for being allowed out of the country. So the Iranian regime controls very, very tightly its own citizens' access to the outside world, and the outside world makes it pretty difficult for Iranians to come. I mean, first of all, you know, the economy has been shot in Iran for a really long time. So for many people, cost-wise, it's prohibitive. But even to go through the process of getting a visa, trying to apply, trying to get somebody to invite you, going through the interview processes, it's really hard. So getting up and leaving isn't really an option for most people. And I understand that in our part of the world, we're so lucky that we have this complete right to kind of roam about the place, you know, without thinking twice about it. I guess COVID gave us all a little bit of an insight into what it's like when everything is difficult and bureaucratic, and you have to have lots of papers and tick different boxes. So yeah, that's the reason why the majority of people don't leave. Having said that, Iran does have the greatest brain drain in the world. So our brightest students do manage to leave because especially American universities are clever enough to take them. It's been a very difficult scene in the last few years with the Muslim ban, as it was called, which actually came in under Obama, but was given a lot more air and energy under Trump, whereby not only could Iranians, but people from Iran, but even people like some of people that I know who were born in Iran but who've never been back for 40 years. Still, if you were born in Iran, even if you no longer hold the passport, not allowed in without a visa. It was also not guaranteed that you would get a visa if you applied. And it made access for kids who are studying in America. It made it very, very hard for them to leave and go back home and come back. And it made it also very hard to have anybody visiting them. So yeah, those are some of the complications around leaving. So of course, there is illegal immigration and people who can leave, you know, with people smugglers do, but that also will generally cost a whole family's life savings, you know, and people did and still do regularly die on these journeys because they're rough, you know.
Quick break here. We are presented, as always, by Fresh Roasted Coffee. If you can see my screen here. Fresh Roasted Coffee, since 2009, this Pennsylvania company has been delivering fresh roasted coffee. You can check out their website at freshroastedcoffee.com or shop them online through a bunch of different places. I'm going to read you something here. Nick, they roast the freshest coffee beans using the most eco-friendly roasting technology on earth. I happen to have a cup right here, fresh roasted coffee. I always record with it. Nick, why don't you tell the people, you're a coffee snob, why don't you tell the people why they should head on down to freshroastedcoffee.com and buy some of this amazing coffee?
First, Mike, let's talk about flavors. You know, if you are a single origin kind of person like you and myself, they've got you. If you are a flavor person, they've got you as well. Flavor packs, individual items as well. And it's not just coffee, folks. You can also get tea. My wife's a tea drinker, so freshroastedcoffee.com's got her too. But more importantly, you can learn about the coffee. When you get to the website, there's a quiz that tells you what's the coffee that's best for you. Sumatra is my blend, and they got that one right. I can tell you that for sure. They'll do the same for you when you head over to the website.
freshroastedcoffee.com. Go to our episode description right now. There's a link right there, and at checkout, you're going to get a discount for this amazing tasting coffee. Head to freshroastedcoffee.com today. And now back to the show.
Kamin, you know, when we think about a regime that's harming or slaughtering its own people, sadly, you know, that in and of itself is not surprising. But from where you stand, you know, and let's also shout you out for a moment. 2001, the Cypress Tree that you'd written about your journey back to Iran. You know, going back 20 years. Well, I'll also share, you mentioned about the videos of the young women. I saw something this morning of girls basically pushing their principal out the school. You know, with, again, you know, no coverings to their hair flowing freely. I think there's the visual of that. 20 years ago, when you returned to Iran, how conceivable would a protest of this sort of been? Because I'm really wondering also, you know, this particular woman's murder by the morality police seems to have sparked a national, now global outrage. Why this particular incident that's really seemed to lit the fuse?
That's a really good question. Why now? You know, in writing my book, I asked that question about the revolution of 79, and I think that, you know, things build up. So it's not just about Mahsa and this moment, it's about everything that has happened since 1979. And you're absolutely right. When I first went, you know, we left in 79, and I think I first went back in 96 or something like that. And even up until the last time I was in Iran, which is over 10 years ago now, unimaginable that something like this would happen. Something really interesting, there have been lots of uprisings. There's been increasing incidents of protests. The protests have gotten more vocal. Some years ago, for the first time, you started hearing the chant of death to Khamenei. Khamenei is the current supreme leader. It's unimaginable. The other day I saw a girl, you know, standing on a car. It was almost as if she was stamping her feet. You know, she was like, Islamic Republic, I don't want it. I don't want it. You know, and that's become a chant. Nemi Kham. It's so, it's not even sophisticated. It's from the heart, you know, it's from the heart and soul of not just this generation, but I think they are carrying all the fury, the frustration, the indignity, the humiliation, the abuse, the violence that every generation of person, but particularly women, any kind of minority in Iran, has suffered for the past 43 years. And previous protests they've really been ramping up since 2009, when there was that sort of green wave against this disputed election. But, you know, if you think in 2009, people's chants and demands were for a recount or for a new vote. Even in 2019, when there were widespread protests, the government shut down the internet and shot 1,500 people. Even then, they were still demanding a review of some laws. Whereas what's really different about now is people are like, this isn't about hijab, this isn't about this is just about enough abuse, no more Islamic Republic, no more supreme leader, no negotiation, and I think that's because every movement that has come before has been trying to change things from within the system. We have been trying for so long to negotiate with these people, to, you know, just get a little more space, to push a few boundaries, and some, you know, all the rights and freedoms that women do have in Iran, which conversely is still more than our neighbors have in Saudi, let's say, it's because of, you know, women, Iranian women and men, pushing the boundaries, pushing and working through the law. But I think you probably do need a younger, angrier generation to come along and go, it hasn't worked. We can't negotiate with these people. And I really feel that at the same time, in the last few years, particularly, the casualness of the violence that is being meted out to the Iranian people in this really commonplace, everyday way has become shocking. I mean, shocking. You know, you've probably seen some of the videos of how these men mostly, but also women in the morality police, go up and talk to people on the streets, and how you see the way that these people, these security forces, are hitting the women, you know, with the butt of their guns. Or it's so inhuman, it's so casual, it's just so. And I think that this is the response to that. I think this is human spirit that just cannot take that much abuse after a while. So why Mahsa Amini? Why right now? I think that she has been an absolute trigger point for decades of violence, abuse, indignity. You know, if this was just about the hijab, then maybe they could be just talking about the hijab. But this is talking about a country that should be one of the richest countries in the world in terms of our resources with oil and gas. but the majority of people there are living on less than $200 a month. You know, the middle class has been destroyed. The wealth of the elite has gone through the roof. You know, there's nothing like the wealth that you would see in the Shah's time. The way the mullahs and their you know cronies have eaten the wealth of our nation, the corruption, you know, the hypocrisy. You know, the Iranian people are being, you know, hit with the butt of a gun because of the way that they choose to dress. And meanwhile, these mullahs have mansions in LA, and their daughters and their granddaughters are models and giving parties with their tits hanging out. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that, but you know what I mean? I think it's it's everything, you know. So this piece of fabric and this incident has become a symbol of everything that this regime represents. And that's why it's not about Islam. It's not, people are not saying we don't want to be Muslim. They're saying we don't want the Islamic Republic. We don't want them. We don't want to live like this. In fact, devout people that I know in Iran, not just now, but from time, have always said to me that they hate this Islamic Republic as much as anybody, you know, because it makes a mockery of their beliefs. It takes the symbols of their devotion and makes them tools and representatives for repression. So it definitely isn't. You know, I know the regime is putting out this story, presumably to mobilize, you know, the rest of the Muslim world against the Iranian people, that it's about that, but it's not.
Kamin, I want to ask you, you mentioned a couple of things there about the Obama administration and some of the foreign policy measures that have been done by the West. I know the Iranian president has been lambasting the West, saying that this is part of the West and Zionist in terms of all the uprising and protests that have been happening in the country. But I want to get from you, because I was telling you this off air about this immigration attorney that I was speaking with that's Iranian, that said, remove the sanctions. Every day, Iranians are facing this. You just mentioned under $200 a month. I don't know how anybody could survive on that. But the economic sanctions, the way they've been treated as a pariah, to use your words, what is something that the West, the US, other countries can do to help in this effort? I feel like as an American myself, I hear you talk and I hear the frustration in your voice. As somebody being Iranian, I know the struggles of somebody being Cuban and seeing family members going through something similar. And when we saw the protest that happened last July in Cuba, when the government was doing something similar, not to this scale, but something similar. What is something that the West can do right away, short term, long term? And then how can everyday people that are listening to this help?
It's a really good question, Mike. I wish I had an easy answer. You know what? In a way, I don't know. Now, the sanctions are not helpful, because even though I know that there's now targeted sanctions against particular individuals, and I don't know if that can help, maybe it can. But the sanctions generally have been used to, or what they do is that they can be circumvented, you know, by back channels, by people who have enough money and power. So mostly the sanctions have fallen on ordinary people who can't get medication for their cancer, you know, girls who can't get the birth control pill, you know, really ordinary things like this. So the sanctions are not helpful to the population, and they don't particularly seem to hurt the regime. They just hurt the people. So I don't know that sanctions are helpful. What can the West do? I don't know, because, you know, historically there is a really long and deep and complicated history of foreign interference inside Iran's affairs also. So I've had also people, other people who know something about world affairs, who've got it slightly wrong, I think, in this instance, and who've gone, this is, you know, America must be behind it. And this is what the regime is saying. They always say this. I would say in this instance, it's absolutely not true. As far as I can see this, and as far as I understand, this is a grassroots movement that has literally exploded from the streets. It has no leaders. The fact that the internet is down most of the time means that people are organizing in ways that are not, you know, the ways that you would expect. So how they are doing it, I'm not sure. But at least for now, no foreign power has co-opted these protests. This is very much about the Iranian people crying out against, what we can do is, what you said, Mike, right there, is you understand a little bit because of, your own ancestry and what happened in Cuba, is we can make human connections. We can try and understand. I think one of the things that people have said to me is, it's in a foreign language. We don't really know what's what. We don't really know what we can say, how we can amplify stuff. And I get it. So I think having a little sense of a bit of imaginative kind of hamdali sympathy, empathy is really useful to think. I think this quite often as I go about my daily life here in Italy. I think, wow, if I was in Iran, I couldn't do this. If I was, I know that doesn't feel like it's useful, but I think it is, in the sense that I think whatever happens, and who knows what can possibly happen inside Iran, it has to happen at the hands of the Iranian people. If they succeed or if they get brutally crushed, foreign powers cannot be involved. Iranian sovereignty is something that my country has been doing revolutions for since 1906, and every time that we've gone some way to having sovereignty and democracy in our own power, we have had an outside power come in and crush it. It was Great Britain and Imperial Russia before that. It was Britain and America. There's lots of people who are convinced, and there's some evidence to say that even the revolution of 79 was backed by foreign powers. I don't know. So I don't know the answer to what the West can do other than hands off,
right?
Get involved. If you try and go in and give the protesters money or anything, they will just get more trouble, because then they will be tools of a Western thing. So in a way, from a foreign policy point of view, this isn't very sophisticated, and I need to talk to my activist friends to understand what is more useful. But I think hands off. I do think some individual pressure on people in the regime would be a good idea. I do think that it would have probably been okay for the UN on the first days of the protests, when so many more young girls were killed, particularly, but also young men, to have not allowed, Raisi to take to the stage in New York and to give a speech telling the West off. It would have been really elegant of Macron to have refused to have his picture taken with him. I mean, I think that we feel a sense of hypocrisy and betrayal to know that this man was standing up on the stage at the UN when he was killing his own people at home. One of the hardest things being in the diaspora has been trying to tread a line between denouncing the regime and not giving the West an excuse to go to war against my country. So that's the difficult thing, because until now, it feels like the Iranian population has been identified with the regime in the West. It's been a really hard one to negotiate for those of us who are outside and who want to raise awareness. On a personal level, I think you can probably write to your representative and say, we need to not have business dealings with the regime of Iran. We need to not, but maybe we need to think of a more intelligent way to do it than just broad sanctions that hurt the people.
Right.
And on an individual level, I know it doesn't feel like a lot, but honestly, amplifying stuff on social media and using those hashtags like hashtag Masa Amini, they're really, really, really useful. People in Iran see them and they take courage and strength from them. And that's, in a way, all we can do is give them our support. They're the ones that have to do it. They're the ones that have to face the bullets. They're the ones that have to take back the country if that's going to happen.
Right. Well, I mean, I hear it in your voice, and I feel for everything that's going on there. I didn't even tell you this off air, but a friend of mine's, they have a family friend that was arrested in the protest as well, a nephew of one of my friends. So I feel for what is happening there in this country. You can check out Kamin's work at kamin.co.uk. Check out her website, follow her on social media, amplify the hashtags like she just mentioned. Kamin, I can't thank you so much for coming on the podcast today, not only sharing your personal story of how your family fled Iran, but also informing us and educating us, which is the goal of this show. Thank you so much for hopping on the podcast. Continued success to you, and please stay safe.
Thank you so much, Mike. Thank you, Mike and Nick, and thank you to all of your listeners for giving this your attention. Thank you.
Hey, thanks for watching the Can We Please Talk podcast. Whatever clip you just watched, we hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you stick around for some more. Subscribe to the channel. My partner's over here smashing the button. Come on, do him a favor. So hit subscribe.